The United States Federal Reserve has held a prominent position as the world's reserve currency for almost 80 years, dominating the global financial landscape and influencing economies across the world. However, as we move into the future, it's becoming increasingly clear that the American greenback is coming to the end of its era of hegemonic rule. In this video, we will take a dive into the history of the dollar as a world reserve currency, explore how it rose to its current position, and examine the signs that are pointing to its imminent decline. What's more, we'll delve into detail about how exactly the United States Federal Reserve is robbing the rest of the world blind. Before I get into the video, I would like to take a moment to shout out to Peruvian Bull, whose dollar Endgame thesis inspired this video. Link below if you would like to read his original work. Okay, with that out of the way, let's start by defining what I mean when I say world reserve currency. A world reserve currency is a currency that is widely accepted as a means of payment for international trade and settlement. World reserve currencies are always backed by powerful, wealthy nations, and earn their status through a reputation of having a strong and stable economy. Before the US dollar took the title, it was held by the British pound, which lost it after the devastation of the First and Second World Wars. Before the pound, it was the Spanish silver peso. Having a currency like this, one that is universally trusted and accepted, is very useful for international trade. It enabled central banks to shore up their currency reserves with a reliable asset, which can be vital in the event of the bank undergoing their own currency crisis. So how did the US dollar rise up to take the pound's spot on the throne? During the height of World War II, Allied powers in Europe sent a significant amount of gold reserves overseas due to fear of invasion. By the end of the war, the Fed held greater than 50% of all the above-ground gold reserves on the planet. This fact, combined with a robust economy and infrastructure untouched by war, made the US the de facto choice for a new world reserve currency, as the pound was no longer viable. For a while, this system would work great. US economic growth spurred on the rebuilding of Europe post-World War II, and international trade flourished. However, after a few decades, some cracks began to surface. The US started borrowing massively in the 60s to fund not only significant new social programs, but also the Vietnam War. This led to people starting to question whether the US truly had the gold to back up their lavish spending. The unease would eventually lead to a full-on run on gold after then French President Charles de Gaulle gave his famous Criterion speech, where he called out the Fed for taking advantage of its position to export inflation caused by its money printing to the rest of the world. More on this later in the video. Ultimately, this would lead to President Richard Nixon giving this speech.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
This change was not welcomed by the international community, and despite Nixon claiming it would lead to greater prosperity and economic stability than the years prior, this was quickly shown to be wrong as the United States fell into a period of prolonged stagflation, a combination of both high inflation and economic recession, something many economists at the time believed to be impossible due to something called the Phillips curve. To put it simply, high unemployment leads to less spending and less demand, which leads to low inflation or even deflation. By this logic, one should never see inflation at the same time as an economic downturn. And yet, the impossible became reality. In an effort to create new demand for the US dollar, the US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger made a secret deal with OPEC, a cartel of oil-producing nations. In exchange for military and political protection, oil contracts would only be filled in US dollars. If you want to buy oil from OPEC, you have to grease America's palms. Thus, the petrodollar was born. Everyone needs oil, so naturally demand for the US dollar surged. However, this still wasn't enough to stop the unrelenting inflation, and so Paul Volcker, then chair of the Federal Reserve, decided to employ the nuclear option. In March of 1980, the Fed would raise interest rates to 20% and keep them above 16% until May of 1981. Using this method, known as the Volcker shock, they managed to get inflation under control, and for the next decade, the USA would have to deal with a prolonged period of heightened interest rates as a result, with rates not returning to their pre-inflation lows until the early 90s. Over the years to follow, the developed world has enjoyed a period of economic growth and global trade. With the gold standard of distant memory, fiat money has become the norm. Creditors now accept the new paradigm, along with its risk of inflation or devaluation that would not exist in the old system. Today, the global monetary system consists entirely of free-floating fiat currencies. Now, one thing that is important to keep in mind about the world reserve currency is that it creates a significant amount of inherent buying pressure for the US dollar. Let me explain. Imagine you're the leader of a small nation. Let's use Liberia as an example. You decide you want to grow your economy and enter global trade, so you open up a central bank. This bank will issue a currency, Liberian dollars, that will be used as legal tender enforced by your government. The bank will further be responsible for maintaining the stability of the currency as well as acting as an emergency lender in the case of an economic crisis. But there's one issue. Despite having the power to print Liberian dollars endlessly, you know you cannot have your central bank use its own currency as a majority of its reserves. Why? Well, if your currency comes under attack on global exchange markets, you have to be able to defend it. If its trade value is too high, the solution is easy. Print more money. But if the opposite is true, and it's losing value, then printing money will only make it worse. You need a different, reliable currency in your reserves to utilize in buying your own currency back from the market to keep the price stable. This form of currency defense is called defending the peg. Liberia, using the US dollar as the majority of its currency reserves, ultimately has little impact on the dollar's value. However, under the current system, virtually every country in the world has a central bank, and they all hold the dollar as their main reserve currency. This creates massive buying pressure on treasuries and US dollars. Using Liberia as an example, it works like this. Your economy grows, and with it the size of your financial system. Your central bank needs to hold more currency reserves in the case of a crisis. Your central bank prints Liberian dollars to buy US dollars in the form of treasuries. This increases the prices of US treasuries, effectively lowering the treasury rates. Buying these treasuries is the same as lending. Essentially, this is you lending money to the US government at increasingly lower interest. The US government then gets to deficit spend, financing its wars, entitlements, and infrastructure. Deficit spending leads to higher overall government debt. They can maintain this as they know they have guaranteed buyers for their debt. Government either spends this money directly or transfers it to American citizens through transfer payments. Government agencies and consumers then buy raw materials, consumer goods, agricultural products, etc. As these goods come from developing countries, this money flows back to exporting nations with trade surpluses. This grows these nations' economies, starting the cycle over again from the beginning. The result of this? Liberia has to print money and gains higher inflation as a result. The US gets to import consumer products for cheap and export the inflation away. However, all of these cheap goods come at a price. Because other countries' central bank need a US dollar on their balance sheet, the US has to run persistent and increasing trade deficits. There is no immediate negative impacts, but in the long run this process is unsustainable, as the world reserve currency country becomes unproductive due to the system forcing the world reserve currency holder to be a net importer. Ever wonder why US manufacturing left? As world trade grows, the trade deficit grows, and the benefits and drawbacks increase over time. Eventually, the imbalance becomes so great that something snaps, just like it did for the pound post-World War II, where policymakers chose the route of deflation in 1921, creating a Great Depression for the UK long before the US ever experienced it. Furthermore, the US dollar continues to dominate global trade through the SWIFT network. SWIFT is a payment system used by multinational banks, institutions, and corporations to settle trade worldwide. US dollar is the preferred payment method within the system, thus forcing other countries to adopt the dollar in international trade. This is one of the results of the petrodollar system I mentioned earlier. When Chile and South Africa trade copper, for example, they have to transact in dollars, because a SWIFT member bank in South Africa will not accept Chilean pesos as payment, as there is a smaller, less liquid market for it, and it doesn't want to take a trading loss when converting it to a more usable currency. The contract itself is priced in US dollars, so if that merchant bank wants to sell it, they can quickly find a buyer. In fact, SWIFT itself published a report in 2014 that found that the US dollar accounts for almost 80% of all world trade. This process is called dollarization, where the dollar is used as the medium of exchange for a contract, in the place of some other currency, even between non-US trading partners. It is through exploiting this advantage that the United States has become the wealthiest and most powerful nation in the history of this planet. Their position on the world stage today echoes that of Rome at its height. The United States dollar has held a dominant position as the world's reserve currency for almost 8 decades, with the Fed utilizing its power to rob the developing world blind of its resources. but its era of hegemonic rule seems to be coming to an end. The last time global creditors started to lose faith in the US dollar, we saw massive inflation, unemployment, and stagnation in the US, in a period of rapid demographic and economic growth in the rest of the world. If creditors become worried again, the result could be catastrophic, and with the cracks already starting to show, how long does the dollar have left? Leave a comment down below with your thoughts, and as always, leave a like if you like the video, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and thanks for watching.